Whoa, 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 yeah, we are in the place to be, yeah, 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 yeah.
Hi-ho, Chibi Mythos here, and welcome to our annual bonus episode of the Little Old People podcast. I'm here with my co-old person, Mark.
AKA the Little Black Dude. If this is your first time listening, we're two oldish nerds looking at random fandoms from varying directions.
I'm a historian and archaeologist by degree and a former wage slave by trade. Mark's a jeweler, YouTuber, and fellow fan enthusiast. Now, as many of you know, in Middle-earth, March 25th is the day that Frodo and Sam reach Mount Doom and destroy the One Ring, thus vanquishing Sauron once and for all.
To honor this momentous day, the Tolkien Society has declared March 25th Tolkien Reading Day. Members and fans the world over celebrate by reading passages from their favorite Tolkien works.
This year's theme is love and friendship, something that our modern world often seems to be lacking. Tolkien's works, on the other hand, are full of strange, unusual, and I dare say unlikely friendships. Gandalf and the Hobbits, Bilbo and the Dwarves, even Bilbo and Lord Elrond. To our modern ears, love only has one or two meanings, and it is usually assumed to be romantic until proven otherwise. Yet Tolkien shows us many instances of love as meaning unwavering loyalty, commitment, admiration, and even friendship. And yet I would argue that our modern definitions are just as powerful, as I happily welcome to our show guest fan enthusiast, Soma Sor. Soma, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Chibi Mythos, and I am excited to be here today for this episode of Lord of the Rings and Love and Friendship, and I'm excited to be narrating it today.
Well, you and I have known each other for years, and I have dragged you through many, many of my nerds, but this seems to be the only ones that have stuck, so I'm very glad to have you on reading with us today.
Well, I'm not sure if you dragged me or if I dragged you. I've been a J.R.R. Tolkien enthusiast since I was in the 5th grade, so
Okay,
to
fair.
see them actually take the books and turn them into successful live action films and to succeed for over 20 years is really exciting. So I'm glad to be asked to narrate this portion of those films.
In honor of this year's theme, we will be reading from The Return of the King, Book 6, Chapter 3, Mount Doom.
The hateful night passed slowly and reluctantly. Such daylight as followed was dim, for here, as the mountain drew near, the air was ever murky, while out from the dark tower there crept the veils of shadow that Sauron wove about himself. Frodo was lying on his back, not moving. Sam stood beside him, reluctant to speak, and yet knowing that the word now lay with him. He must set his master's will to work for another effort. At length, stooping and caressing Frodo's brow, he spoke in his ear.
"Wake up, Master!"
he said.
"Time for another start."
As if roused by a sudden bell, Frodo rose quickly and stood up and looked away southwards. But when his eyes beheld the mountain and the desert, he quailed again.
Can't manage it, Sam,
he said.
It's such a weight to carry. Such a weight.
Sam knew before he spoke that it was vain, that such words might do more harm than good. But in his pity he could not keep silent.
"Then let me carry a bit for you, Master,"
he said.
"You know I would, and gladly, as long as I have any strength."
A wild light came into Frodo's eyes.
Stay away! Don't touch me!
He cried.
It is mine, I say! Be off!
His hand strayed to his sword hilt, but then quickly his voice changed.
No, Sam,
he said sadly.
But you must understand, it is my burden, and no one else can bear it. It is too late now, Sam, dear. You mustn't help me in that way again. I am almost in its power now. I could not give it up, and if you tried to take it, I should go mad.
Sam nodded.
"I understand,"
he said.
"but I've been thinking, Mr. Frodo. There's other things we might do without. Why not lighten the load a bit? We're going that way now, as straight as we can make it."
He pointed to the mountain.
It's no good taking anything we're not sure to need.
Frodo looked again towards the mountain.
No,
He said,
we shan't need much on that road, and at its end, nothing.
Picking up his orc shield, he flung it away and threw his helmet after it. Then, pulling off the gray cloak, he undid the heavy belt and let it fall to the ground, and the sheathed sword with it. The shreds of the black cloak he tore off and scattered.
There, I'll be an orc no more,
He cried.
and I'll bear no weapon fair or foul. Let them take me if they will.
Sam did likewise and put aside his orc gear. He took out all of the things in his pack. Somehow each of them had become dear to him, if only because he had borne them so far with so much toil. Hardest of all it was to part with his cooking gear. Tears welled in his eyes at the thought of casting it away.
Do you remember that bit of rabbit, Mr. Frodo?
He said,
And our place under the warm bank in Captain Faramir's country? The day I saw an olifant?
No, I'm afraid not, Sam.
said Frodo.
At least, I know that such things happen, but I cannot see them. No taste of food, no feel of water, no sound of wind, no memory of tree, or grass, or flower, no image of moon or stars are left to me. I am naked in the dark. Sam, there is no veil between me and the wheel of fire. I began to see it, even with my waking eyes, and all else fades.
Sam went to him and kissed his hand.
And the sooner we're rid of it, the sooner to rest.
He said haltingly, finding no better words to say.
Talking won't mend nothing.
He muttered to himself as he gathered up all the things that they had chosen to cast away. He was not willing to leave them lying open in the wilderness for any eyes to see.
Stinker picked up that orc shirt, seemingly. And he isn't gonna add a sword to it. His hands are bad enough when empty. And he isn't gonna mess with my pans.
With that, he carried all the gear away to one of the many gaping fissures that scored the land and threw them in. The clatter of his precious pans as they fell down into the dark was like a death knell to his heart. He came back to Frodo, and then, of his elven rope, he cut a short piece to serve his master as a girdle and bind the gray cloak close to his waist. The rest he carefully coiled and put back in his pack. Beside that, he kept only the remnants of their way bread and the water bottle, and Sting still hanging by his belt. And hidden away in a pocket of his tunic next to his breast, the phial of Galadriel and the little box that she gave him for his own. Now at last they turned their faces to the mountain and set out, thinking no more of concealment, bending their weariness and failing wills only to the one task of going on. In the dimness of its dreary day, few things even in that land of vigilance could have espied them, save from close at hand. Of all the slaves of the Dark Lord, only the Nazgul could have warned him of that peril that crept, small but indomitable, into the very heart of his guarded realm. But the Nazgul and their black wings were abroad on another errand. They were gathered far away, shadowing the march of the captains of the West, and thither the thought of the Dark Tower was turned. That day it seemed to Sam that his master had found some new strength, more than could be explained by the lightening of the load that he had to carry. In the first marches they went further and faster than he had hoped. The land was rough and hostile, and yet they made much progress, and ever the mountain drew nearer. But as the day wore on, and all too soon the dim light began to fail, Frodo stooped again and began to stagger, as if the renewed effort had squandered his remaining strength. At their last halt, he sank down and said,
"Thirsty, Sam?"
and did not speak again. Sam gave him a mouthful of water. Only one more mouthful remained. He went without himself. And now, as once more the night of Mordor closed over them, through all his thoughts there came the memory of water, and every brook or stream or fount that he had ever seen, under green willow shades or twinkling in the sun, danced and rippled for his torment behind the blindness of his eyes. He felt the cool mud about his toes as he paddled in the pool at Bywater with Jolly Cotton and Tom and Nibs and their sister Rosie.
But that was years ago.
He sighed.
And far away. The way back, if there is one, goes past the mountain.
He could not sleep, and he held a debate with himself.
Well, come now. We've done better than you hoped,
he said sturdily.
Began well, anyway. I reckon we crossed half the distance before we stopped. One more day will do it.
And then he paused.
Don't be a fool, Sam Gamgee,
came an answer in his own voice.
He won't go another day like that, if he moves at all. And you can't go on much longer, giving him all the water and most of the food. I can go on a good way, though. And I will. Where to? To the mountain, of course. But what then, Sam Gamgee? What then? When you get there, what are you going to do? He won't be able to do anything for himself.
To his dismay, Sam realized that he had not got an answer to this. He had no clear idea at all. Frodo had not spoken much to him of his errand, and Sam only knew vaguely that the ring had somehow to be put into the fire.
The cracks of doom,
he muttered, the old name rising to his mind.
Well, Master knows how to find them. I don't. There you are,
came the answer.
It's all quite useless. He said so himself. You are the fool, going on hoping and toiling. You could have lain down and gone to sleep together days ago if you hadn't been so dogged. But you'll die just the same, or worse. You might just as well lie down and give it up now. You'll never get to the top anyway. I'll get there, if I leave everything but my bones behind,
said Sam.
And I'll carry Mr. Frodo up myself, if it breaks my back and heart. So stop arguing!
At that moment, Sam felt a tremor in the ground beneath him, and he heard or sensed a deep, remote rumble, as of thunder imprisoned under the earth. There was a brief red flame that flickered under the clouds and died away. The mountain, too, slept uneasily. The last stage of their journey to Oradurin came, and it was a torment greater than Sam had ever thought he could bear. He was in pain and so parched that he could no longer swallow even a mouthful of food. It remained dark, not only because of the smokes of the mountain. There seemed to be a storm coming up, and away to the southeast there was a shimmer of lightnings under the black skies. Worst of all, the air was full of fumes. Breathing was painful and difficult, and a dizziness came on them so that they staggered and often fell. And yet, their wills did not yield, and they struggled on. The mountain crept up ever nearer until, if they lifted their heavy heads, it filled all their sight, looming vast before them. A huge mass of ash and slag and burned stone, out of which a sheer-sided cone was raised into the clouds. Before the day-long dusk ended and true night came again, they had crawled and stumbled to its very feet. With a gasp, Frodo cast himself upon the ground. Sam sat by him. To his surprise, he felt tired, but lighter, and his head seemed clear again. No more debates disturbed his mind. He knew all the arguments of despair and would not listen to them. His will was set, and only death would break it. He felt no longer either desire or need of sleep, but rather of watchfulness. He knew that all the hazards and perils were now drawing together to a point. The next day would be a day of doom, the day of final effort or disaster. the last gasp. But when would it come? The night seemed endless and timeless, minute after minute falling dead and adding up to no passing hour, bringing no change. Sam began to wonder if a second darkness had begun and no day would ever reappear. At last, he groped for Frodo's hand. It was cold and trembling. His master was shivering.
I didn't ought to have left my blanket behind,
muttered Sam. And lying down, he tried to comfort Frodo with his arms and body. Then sleep took him, and the dim light of the last day of their quest found them side by side. The wind had fallen the day before as it shifted from the west, and now it came from the north and began to rise. And slowly the light of the unseen sun filtered down into the shadows where the hobbits lay.
Now for the last gasp,
said Sam as he struggled to his feet. He bent over Frodo, rousing him gently. Frodo groaned, but with a great effort of will he staggered up, and then he fell upon his knees again. He raised his eyes with difficulty to the dark slopes of Mount Doom towering above him, and then pitifully he began to crawl forward on his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes.
I said I'd carry him if it broke my back,
he muttered.
And I will. Come, Mr. Frodo,
he cried.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you and it as well. So up you get. Come on, Mr. Frodo dear. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell him where to go, and he'll go.
As Frodo clung upon his back, arms loosely about his neck, legs clasped firmly under his arms, Sam staggered to his feet, and then, to his amazement, he felt the burden light. He had feared that he would have barely strength to lift his master alone, and beyond that, he had expected to share in the dreadful, dragging weight of the accursed ring. But it was not so. Whether because Frodo was so worn by his long pains, wound of knife and venomous sting, and sorrow, fear, and homeless wandering, or because some gift of final strength was given to him, Sam lifted Frodo with no more difficulty than if he was carrying a hobbit child, pig-a-back in some romp on the lawns or hayfields of the Shire. He took a deep breath and started off. They had reached the mountain's foot on its northern side, and a little to the westward. There its long gray slopes, though broken, were not sheer. Frodo did not speak, and so Sam struggled on as best he could, having no guidance but the will to climb as high as might be before his strength gave out and his will broke. On he toiled, up and up, turning this way and that to lessen the slope, often stumbling forward, and at last crawling like a snail with a heavy burden on its back. When his will could drive him no further, and his limbs gave way, he stopped and laid his master gently down. Frodo opened his eyes and drew a breath. It was easier to breathe up here above the reeks that coiled and drifted down below.
You, Sam,
he said in a cracked whisper.
How far is there to go?
I don't know,
said Sam.
because I don't know where we're going.
He looked back, and then he looked up, and he was amazed to see how far his last effort had brought him. The mountain, standing ominous and alone, had looked taller than it was. Sam saw now that it was less lofty than the high passes of the Efelduath, which he and Frodo had scaled. The confused and tumbled shoulders of its great base rose for maybe 3,000 feet above the plain, and above them was reared half as high again in its tall central cone, like a vast oast or chimney caped with a jagged crater. But already Sam was more than halfway up the base, and the plain of the Gorgoroth was dim below him, wrapped in fume and shadow. As he looked up, he would have given a shout if his parched throat had allowed him. For amid the rugged humps and shoulders above him, he saw plainly a path or road. It climbed like a rising girdle from the west and wound snake-like up the mountain until before it went round out of view, it reached the foot of the cone upon its eastern side. Sam could not see the course immediately above him, where it was lowest, for a steep slope went up from where he stood. But he guessed that if he could only struggle on just a little way further up, they would strike this path. A gleam of hope returned to him. They might conquer the mountain yet.
Why, it must have been put there on purpose,
he said to himself.
If it wasn't there, I'd have to say I was beaten in the end.
The path was not put there for the purposes of Sam. He did not know it, but he was looking at Sauron's road from the Broadur to the Samath Nor, the Chambers of Fire. Out from the Dark Tower's huge western gate, it came over a deep abyss by a vast bridge of iron, and then passing into the plain, it ran for a league between the two smoking chasms, and so it reached a long sloping causeway that led up onto the mountain's eastern side. Thence turning and encircling all its wide girth from south to north, it climbed at last high in the upper cone, but still far from the reeking summit, to a dark entrance that gazed back east to the window of the eye in Sauron's shadow-mantled fortress, often blocked or destroyed by the tumults of the mountain's furnaces. Always that road was repaired and cleaned again by the labors of the countless orcs. Sam drew a deep breath. There was a path, but how was he to get up the slope to it, he did not know. First, he must ease his aching back. He lay flat beside Frodo for a while. Neither spoke. Slowly the light grew. Suddenly, a sense of urgency which he did not understand came to Sam. It was almost as if he had been called.
Now! Now, or it will be too late!
He braced himself and got up. Frodo also seemed to have felt the call. He struggled to his knees.
I'll crawl, Sam,
he gasped. So foot by foot, like small gray insects, they crept up the slope. They came to the path and found that it was broad, paved with broken rubble and beaten ash. Frodo clambered onto it, and then moved as if by some compulsion. He turned slowly to face the east. Far off, the shadows of Sauron hung, but torn by some gust of wind out of the world, or else moved by some great disquiet within. The mantling clouds swirled for a moment, drew aside, and then he saw rising blacker and darker than the vast shades amid which it stood, the cruel pinnacles and iron crown of the topmost tower of Barad-dûr. One moment only it stared out, but as from some great window immeasurably high there stabbed northward a flame of red, the flicker of a piercing eye, and then the shadows were furled again and the terrible vision was removed. The eye was not turned to them. It was gazing north to where the captains of the West stood at bay, and thither all its malice was now bent as the power moved to strike its deadly blow. But Frodo, at that dreadful glimpse, fell as one stricken mortally. His hands sought the chain about its neck. Sam knelt by him. Faint, almost inaudibly, he heard Frodo whispering,
"Help me, Sam! Help me! Hold my hand! I can't stop it!"
Sam took his master's hand. and laid them together, palm to palm, and kissed them. And then he held them gently between his own. The thought suddenly came to him.
He spotted us! It's all up, or soon will be. Now, Sam Gamgee, this is the end of ends.
Again, he lifted Frodo and drew his hands down to his own breast, letting his master's legs dangle. Then he bowed his head and struggled off along the climbing road. It was not as easy a way to take as it had looked at first. By fortune, the fires that had poured forth in the great turmoils when Sam stood upon Cirith Ungol had flowed down mainly on the southern and western slopes, and the road on this side was not blocked. Yet in many places it had crumbled away or was crossed by gaping rents. After climbing eastward for some time, it bent back upon itself at a sharp angle and went westward for a space. There, at the bend, it was cut deep through a crag of old weathered stone, once long ago vomited from the mountain's furnaces. Panting under his load, Sam turned the bend. And even as he did so, out of the corner of his eye, he had a glimpse of something falling from the crag, like a small piece of black stone that had toppled off as he passed. A sudden weight smote him as he crashed forward, tearing the backs of his hands that still clasped his master's. Then he knew what had happened, for above him as he lay, he heard a hated voice.
"Wicked Master!"
It hissed.
"Wicked Master cheats us! Cheats Smeagol! Gollum! He mustn't go that way! He mustn't hurt Precious! Give it to Smeagol! Yes! Give it to us! Give it to us!"
With a violent heave, Sam rose up. At once he drew his sword, but he could do nothing. Gollum and Frodo were locked together. Gollum was tearing at his master, trying to get at the chain and the ring. This was probably the only thing that could have roused the dying embers of Frodo's heart and will. An attack, an attempt to wrest his treasure from him by force. He fought back with a sudden fury that amazed Sam and Gollum also. Even so, things might have gone far otherwise if Gollum himself had remained unchanged. But whatever dreadful paths, lonely and hungry and waterless, he had trodden, driven by a devouring desire and a terrible fear that had left grievous marks on him, he was a lean, starved, haggard thing, all bones and tight-drawn, sallow skin. A wild light flamed in his eyes, but his malice was no longer matched by his old gripping strength. Frodo flung him off and rose up, quivering.
Down! Down!
He gasped, clutching his hand to his breast, so that beneath the covering of his leathered shirt he clasped the ring.
Down, you creeping thing, and out of my path! Your time is at its end. You cannot betray me or slay me now.
Then suddenly, under the eaves of the Emyn-Muil, Sam saw these two rivals with other vision. A crouching shape, scarcely more than the shadow of a living thing, a creature now wholly ruined and defeated, yet filled with a hideous lust and rage. And before it stood stern, untouchable, now by pity, a figure robed in white, but at its breast it held a wheel of fire. Out of the fire there spoke a commanding voice.
Be gone, and trouble me no more. If you touch me ever again, you shall cast yourself into the fire of doom.
The crouching shape backed away, terror in its blinking eyes, and yet, at the same time, insatiable desire. Then the vision passed, and Sam saw Frodo standing, hand on breast, his breath coming in great gasps, and Gollum at his feet, resting on his knees, with his wide splayed hands upon the ground.
Look out!
Cried Sam.
He'll spring!
He stepped forward, brandishing his sword.
Quick, master!
He gasped.
Go on! No time to lose! I'll deal with him! Go on!
Frodo looked at him, as if at one now far away.
Yes, I must go on,
He said.
Farewell, Sam. This is the end at last. On Mount Doom, doom shall fall. Farewell.
He turned and went on, walking slowly but erect, up the climbing path.
This has always been my favorite part of Return of the King. We hear the music swell, Sam lifts up Frodo, and 20 years plus I've watched these movies over and over again, and that scene still makes me ugly cry. When I heard about this year's theme and love and friendship, this is the only thing that came to my mind. It most encapsulates in his stories the est of that definition.
Love and friendship are two things that people don't think go hand in hand, but they absolutely do, because the connections between people on their most fundamental levels are probably the most important ones that human beings ever make. When you have someone who is a good enough friend that they will go to the proverbial Mount Doom with you, that is a friend you will keep for the rest of your existence.
One of my favorite things to do is watch new people on YouTube who've never seen Lord of the Rings before, watch it for the first time. Inevitably, sometimes even before the first movie is over, they're just like, I need a friend like Sam. And somebody in the comments will always say, we don't need a friend like Sam, we need to be Sam.
Which is the same thing. When it comes down to it, Samwise Gamgee is the person that we need to be in order for our society to be just a little bit better. Because you look up selflessness in the dictionary, you find Sam waving at you and holding a potato.
Yes, exactly. Potatoes. So thank you very, very much. We greatly appreciate you coming on and reading with us today.
You are welcome. It was my pleasure.
Do you have anything that you want to promote? Shameless plugs for yourself?
Shameless plugs. Oh, yes. Make sure that you check out Human Services Consulting and Training at HSCT Publishing for Leadership Management Toolbox Training. And that's it.
All right. Very good. Thank you.
Shameless plugs.
Absolutely. All right. Very good. Thank you. So Please enjoy your Tolkien Reading Day 2022. And just remember, as much as we would all like to have a friend like Sam, we all need to be Sam.
Truer words never spoken. And if you'd like to hear us speak some more of these true words, and some silly ones, and perhaps some serious ones, we promise we'll try not to do that as often, but
yes.
Definitely. You can find us in a number of places. We have a link tree that connects to all of our social media, like, for example, our Twitter, our Facebook, and our podcast at linktr.ee/little-old-people-podcast. We are on Sounder. We are on Google Podcasts. You should be able to find us pretty much anywhere that you are listening to podcasts. But if you want to listen to us on Sounder, it's at littleoldpeoplepodcast.sounder.fm/show/little-old-people-podcast. Yes, it's a mouthful. If you would like to send us a message on Facebook, you can find us at facebook.com/littleoppodcast. If you want to tweet at us, you'll find us at twitter.com/littleoldppodcast. And if you want to send us an email to tell us how great or terrible we are, you can email us at littleoldpeoplepodcast@gmail.com.
You can also listen to more of Mark's nerdy thoughts on his YouTube channel, At Home with a Geek. He's been Mark. I've been Chibi Mythos. She's been Somasaur, your nerdy hosts coast to coast. And we'll catch you in the next one.
Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
This has been a Little Old People Podcast production. Copyright 2022.